I'm just gonna say it, I mostly liked Forspoken. Yes, this game is incredibly flawed, and I still liked it a lot. I know, unpopular opinion, everybody's been saying it's trash. But in order for me to be able to talk about this game properly, I'm just going to issue a spoiler warning not only for Forspoken, but also some light spoilers for Final Fantasy 15 at this time, as this game was made by the same studio. So, consider yourself warned if you have any interest in this game, but also if at any point during this video you end up finding yourself interested by something you see, go play it when you get a chance and come back to the video later. I'm going to get this out of the way now. There has been some recent news about Luminous Productions, the studio behind Forspoken and Final Fantasy 15. The studio is merging with Square Enix proper, and while I'm sure there has been more behind the scenes at play than just Forspoken's dismal reception and protracted development time behind this choice, it is rather nice to see that at least on the surface that a lot of these people who worked on this game, and in a lot of cases Final Fantasy 15 as well, are going to still have their jobs in an industry that usually just shutters underperforming studios. Because between these two games, a lot of the team is clearly talented. But between the development hell that was Final Fantasy 15 and now Forspoken, there is clearly something at play that made it impossible for this team to get a game off the ground without some real concessions. And if I had to guess, keep in mind this is based off of nothing more than a gut feeling and the overall reception coming from the studio, it probably comes down to something as simple as poor project management. And in the case of Forspoken especially, a lack of understanding of what the project was and how to market it. Because if you've only seen the trailers for this game, yeah, they did not do this title any favors. But despite Luminous Productions' shaky track record and development problems, Final Fantasy 15 was a game that I truly came to love, especially after playing the Royal Edition, the most content-complete version of that game. And even though I recognize that the final game was a shadow of what the game could have ultimately been if it didn't languish for as many years as it has since become one of my favorite entries and one of my favorite franchises, in spite of all those hurdles. But that's besides the point. This isn't a review of Final Fantasy 15. I'll do that one day, just not yet. But because of how much I enjoyed Final Fantasy 15, Forspoken was always on my radar. And although Forspoken did not hit nearly as hard as 15 did for me, it certainly ended up leaving far more of an impact than I was ever expecting. First, I should say that I get why people are not rushing out to pick up a $70 game after seeing some goofy trailers and some pretty bad word of mouth. But luckily for me, I was given my copy as a birthday gift from one of my best friends. So factor that in as to why maybe I didn't feel as burned by this game where others have. And by the way, thanks Chris. But that is another point altogether. So what is Forspoken? At its core, it is a story-based RPG that is clearly Luminous's attempt at catering to the West with not only its Western-focused story, but also Ubisoft-inspired open-world design complete with towers that reveal the map and more map clutter than I've ever seen in one of these type of games. So clearly we're off to a great start. But on the other hand, Forspoken is a game about traversal and mobility, featuring magical parkour with some just really enjoyable movement and combat that has quite a bit going for it. It is far more technical than you'd expect, and the spell effects are insane, even if the combat is not always able to be fully realized. But I'll get more into that later in the video. But really that's only part of the equation, as the main reason that a lot of people play RPGs, or more specifically Square Enix published RPGs, are for their story. And really that seems to be where a lot of the criticism for Forspoken seems to be coming from. Or more specifically, the criticism seems to be aimed at this game's dialogue, and even more specifically, our protagonist as a whole, Frey.
Did I just do that?
Well, definitely with my assistance.
I did not just do that.
We did.
I just moved shit with my mind.
Perhaps our connection has somehow awoken some abilities.
I just moved shit with my mind.
I just keep hearing I.
I just moved shit with my freaking mind!
First, for the uninitiated, Forspoken is an isekai, a subgenre of fantasy in which characters are sucked into a world that is completely different from their own. And for some examples from Japanese media, think Sword Art Online, Digimon Adventure, or even Ni no Kuni. And for some Western examples, think Neverending Story, A Kid in King Arthur's Court, or even Black Knight. Our main character, Frey Holland, or just Frey for the rest of this video, is introduced to us in a courthouse. She is a 20-something-year-old that is running out of chances given the state's three strikes law and is facing some serious jail time with her most recent charges of grand larceny. But lucky, and not so lucky for Frey, the Judge Maya Bird, which I think is like a cool little nod to Maya Angelou, she is aware of Frey and decides to let her off with just a stern talking to and some community service. I say unlucky for Frey though because it is clear that the judge is cutting Frey a break because of her past. Frey is a notable person in New York as she was found as an infant abandoned in the Holland Tunnel, which was not only widely publicized, but this led to her being christened with Holland as a last name after the location that she was discovered. And after being found, she spent a childhood of bouncing around the foster care system. Shortly after getting out of the courthouse, Frey comes in contact with some, I guess the best word for them is criminals that she has clearly had some dealings with in the past. And they are not happy with the way that their last deal turned out, so much so that they end up pulling a fucking gun on our main character. But, you know, I guess in a lot of ways that's America for us. Frey escapes and then makes her way into an abandoned apartment building that she has been squatting in. And quick aside, this place is pretty huge as far as New York apartments go. It clearly sucks that Frey is living in an abandoned building in Hell's Kitchen, but she really did manage to stumble into some prime real estate. And in this place, we get a brief look into what makes this character tick. She has a cat named Homer that she is clearly doing her best to take care of, a copy of Alice in Wonderland that serves to be something of foreshadowing for what's to come, a handmade sign that serves as her plan to get out of the messed up situation she's in, some shoes, and a sack of money to aid her in her plan to get away. Frey ends her day by going to sleep after all but falling apart and hoping for better days ahead. But in the shit show that is her life, Frey wakes up to find that her apartment is on fire, with it made apparent that the street toughs from earlier are responsible for the arson. And to make matters even worse, Frey is unable to carry a 10-pound cat and a bag full of money at the same time and makes the choice to save Homer as her bag burns in front of her. This is a stupid scene. I'll admit it. It could have been done so much better, but I guess at this point, you know, plot's got a plot, I guess. So now we find Frey in an even worse situation than she's ever been in, with nowhere to go, no prospects, and some Y2K era themed bucket hat wearing arsonists with itchy trigger fingers after her. Frey then makes the difficult choice of finding a temporary home for her cat, before returning to the Holland Tunnel to celebrate her 21st birthday alone. But as fate or plot convenience would have it, Frey's attention is caught by something in a storefront below. And after committing some light breaking and entering, Frey finds a MacGuffin in the form of a magical bracelet. And after making the choice to try it on, she finds herself transported to a bizarre fantasy world. A fantasy world that we soon learn is called Athea from an unexpected new companion.
Where on earth is this?
Athea?
Who's there?
And technically not Earth. Well, not what you would call Earth, anyway.
I swear to God, asshole, show yourself!
Show myself. I've shown. I'm showing. I can't get more showed. Show myself indeed.
Where are you?
Right here, at the end of your arm. The thing that you so fruitlessly tried to remove. Oh, hello, yes. Oh, perhaps you're smarter than you look.
No.
Yes.
Frey soon finds out that the bracelet that she tried on moments earlier not only serves as some sort of cursed port key, but that the jewelry is also sentient. Speeding things up a bit, our new companion, one that Frey dismissively names Cuff, gives Frey a quick rundown of her situation and the region of the world that she is in. Explains that there is an affliction that is ruining this world, a phenomenon that Frey calls the Break, and that just seems to stick for not just her, but everyone else in this world seems to have been suffering from the ramifications of this plight without coming up with a better name for it. And then Cuff later aids her in fighting off some zombified woodland creatures with this game's elemental combat.
I just move shit with my freaking mind!
After looking for food and shelter and almost being killed by a dragon, Frey finds herself in this world's last bastion for humanity, a town named Sapal. But very quickly that goes south, as the people are not too welcoming, and Frey finds herself in an even worse situation than she was in New York. But at least she now has some earthbending powers and can do some magic boosted parkour, so I guess it's not all too bad. But luckily for Frey, another altruistic woman, a young lady with some eyes that are just a little too unnaturally close together, named Auden, convinces the people of Sepal to cut Frey some slack. And that is when this game really opens up. With this intro out of the way, I'm not going to do a beat by beat of the plot, but instead I'm more interested in the criticism that seems to be aimed at this game. First, the dialogue. While I certainly am not going to be nominating it for any type of award, I think that it is serviceable at its worst and pretty damn solid at its best.
Go ahead, jump.
I...
You would be better off. Isn't that what you believe? I can see it so clearly in your mind you feel you lack purpose. A place in the world. I mean, who would miss you? Who cares? If you live or die.
I care.
They will let you down.
But a lot of that comes from context. And while some of it is definitely written in a how do you do fellow kids kind of way, the majority of the complaints that I have read seem to be pointed at the fact that Frey is unlikable, rude, and foul-mouthed, with liberal usage of the fuck word being most often cited. But having said that, I think it's worth pointing out that although the F word is definitely overused, it seems like a way out from falling into the trap of instantly dating this game by relying on slang that would ultimately be outdated as soon as this game was published. We've all seen examples of TV shows or movies that are placed in contemporary times that try to keep the language authentic by using modern slang.
You're always gaslighting me.
You fucking trigger me.
You are so toxic.
But the problem is that language is constantly changing, and although she may just kind of gravitate to this one word a bit too much, the F word's not going anywhere. There are some examples of language that definitely will become dated in time in Forspoken, but luckily they are mostly tied to naming conventions for equipment, but they are mostly avoided altogether when it comes to the actual dialogue. So in a lot of ways, I didn't find Frey's potty mouth as grating as other people seem to have found it. But in defense of the criticism against Frey, that unlikable, rude, foul-mouthed kind of character, let's consider who we are talking about here, because I think Frey works. She certainly isn't a great person, but given the circumstances that we found her in, I think that it is fairly understandable that this character has found herself closed off, bitter, and distrustful of others. Frey is an orphan. She is alone, she's down on her luck, with even her very name serving as a constant reminder of the fact that she was left as an infant to seemingly fend for herself in the rat-infested New York tunnel system. She has no prospects, she's fallen into desperate measures with rough people, all in hopes of getting out of the uncaring metropolitan sprawl. And now she's found herself in a new world that's on the brink of destruction, where its sole inhabitants feel compelled to lock her up after pointing weapons at her and knocking her around a little bit. I understand that she can be rough around the edges, but through little scenes she is shown to have some humanity, even if it is heavily fortified. First, her relationship with Homer is fairly well established. Little things like her being quick to help a passerby retrieve her lost phone is a quick peek into the inner workings of her mind, and when Frey has no one to turn to, she recognizes that Judge Bird is someone that she could count on to take care of her cat. She recognizes the good thing this woman did for her. Frey also recognizes that Auden is someone that she can lower her guard around a bit, and makes an early alliance with her. And while her early relationship with Cuff is contentious, it definitely cuts from both directions. And then we get some real insight into who Frey is after she meets this girl, Olivia. And I think her relationship with this little girl is emblematic of who Frey is as a character. She is hurt, deeply mistrustful, quick to alienate and save herself from potential heartbreak and betrayal. This is a character that has undergone a lot of trauma in her 21 years, and I think that this character tracks, especially when I think of some of the suburban kids that I've met that harbor far more resentment while having grown up in relatively cozy circumstances. But although Frey is quick to dismiss and avoid, she definitely shows vulnerability and a willingness to connect when she is able to recognize something of herself in others, really when she feels safe. I think when tracked in the context of the story, Frey is less shitty and more of a person with a cool but rude persona. even if she can come across as self-serving and petulant at moments. And I think considering the wider video game medium, it is interesting to see how this angry young woman is so widely disliked. Characters like Kratos, Jack Garland,
Chaos.
and even characters like Squall from Final Fantasy VIII are considered stoic and strong when they can come across as far more rude and downright bloodthirsty in a lot of cases. I do understand why a lot of people don't seem to like this character, and in some ways I don't really think she's written to be very well liked. But I do feel like a lot of the discourse around her is very surface level, and I ultimately left this game more or less enjoying the character. But despite her prickly attitude, the thing that I found most offensive about Frey was the fact that she slept with her shoes on in the bed. And while, yeah, I get that this is a video game and she is far from the first character to be guilty of this, Kiryu has been removing his shoes before going indoors since, like, Yakuza 3, so no, there's no excuse for this shit anymore. You know, in my personal life, I didn't grow up as a homeless orphan woman, and I certainly have never been whisked away to a hostile new world. But I was able to connect to this character and empathize with her in ways that are sometimes hard to articulate. Without going too far into it, I do have some experience with childhood trauma. And this distrustfulness, this ability to quickly alienate others, it took me many years to get under control. And like Frey, I not only dealt with certain things in my past, but I've also been uncertain where I was going to live at various points in my life. And while I've never had to squat in abandoned buildings, I have spent months at a time either couch surfing, spending the odd night or two sleeping in my car, and barely scraping by at a time where, honestly, I just needed some help. And really, there were times where it was just hard to trust people in that environment, and the resentment, it can build at times. But I was lucky in a lot of ways, with more than a few friends who were willing to help when things got out of control. And I'm now nearly a decade removed from those situations. So when I see Frey getting pissed off, I don't know, I just get it. And I think that at its core, this is a game about how trauma shapes people. Auden is quick to help others. Auden is a character whose trauma shaped her into becoming helpful to a fault, with her having lost both of her parents at a young age. And while we do find out that her father is still alive very early on, but more about him in a second, she did not know this. And as a result of growing up as an orphan, she is unwilling to watch others suffer to the point where she would rather work herself to the point of exhaustion than feel like she is unable to help. And almost every character in Sepal is dealing with some sort of similar circumstance. But interestingly, I think the character that really stole the show and made me connect to Forspoken's characters was this man named Robian.
They get inside and sometimes I can't, but I try.
Early on in the game, Auden tasks Frey with looking for her lost father's research about the break. And with Frey and her newfound abilities serving to give her some sort of immunity to the effects of this dying world, Frey heads out to find Robian's lost work. And while she does find some of it, she also finds the man himself. But after decades of living in the corruption, Robian is certainly worse for wear. And it was in this initial meeting where I instantly connected to not only Robian, but how Frey connected to him. After what seems like the ramblings of a madman, Robian and Frey are able to find common ground over the idea of how she found herself in Athea in the first place.
Get back. I fell through a,
Whoosh.
Yeah. Yeah, a whoosh. Yeah, I gotta get back to where I gotta be through a whoosh.
Whoosh. You will get back to where you need to be. Whoosh.
Yes, whoosh!
And just this moment where Robian is able to connect and the childlike excitement he has in this moment of lucidity, this shit hit hard. If you've ever known someone with certain mental illnesses like dementia, Alzheimer's, or even schizophrenia, you'll know these fleeting moments, these coherent vestiges of the person from before they became ill. And I don't think I've ever seen it handled better in a game, and in a lot of cases, media in general. And then there's the bittersweet moment of reconnecting Auden and her father that follows, and it is equally brutal as the joy of having him back comes at the cost of having to recognize that this illness has put up a permanent wall between the two, even if it is clear that the love that they share for one another remains. And really a lot of the plot beats to this narrative work similarly. A lot of the plight in this world stems from the corruption of the four Tantas, the leaders of the four regions of Athea that used to look after its people. These were rulers that were once loved and revered by their subjects, with each of them embodying a particular virtue. But once the break started, these leaders were all driven mad and turned against their own people. And each of them and the battles that ensue, as well as the destruction that they leave in their wake, all of this is just really good storytelling. And by the time the game resolved and the true nature of the break was laid bare, I found myself not only enjoying the overall narrative, but I would go as far as to say that I am really a fan of this story and its characters, and that I was always finding myself consistently surprised. But this solid narrative is a double-edged sword, as when it is coupled with the structure of this game and the admittedly shallow diversions that are littered all around Athea, some really messed up issues with pacing become apparent. First, anything that is not a main mission in this game suffers from a noticeable downgrade in quality. Stilted dialogue, moments of standing still, unable to control Frey as exposition just kind of oozes out, repetitive side missions, limited enemy variety, and a world that is far too big for its own good slow this game down to a crawl. And they undermine the handful of things that this game really has going for it. Being blunt, the things that make this game good are the following: a decent story, some awesome boss fights, some incredible visuals and spell effects, but these are not always consistent, movement that can be a joy when it works well, and combat that is, while solid and varied, is never really able to reach its potential because of a lack of interesting enemies to fight and a difficulty that never really asks for the player to master anything more than the surface level of this game's systems. And what stops this game from being great is virtually everything else. The movement that makes this game engaging, it is non-existent while you're in Sepal, which makes these B-tier side missions drag, as they are usually nothing more than fetch quests, following stray cats around to find off-brand Funko Pops, or simply going to a place to stand still and watch some exposition get doled out. And all these sections just drag, as Frey, who is usually able to scale cliff sides in seconds, run at superhuman speeds, and jump from heights that would kill anyone else without breaking a sweat. The game says fuck all that while in Sepal for only the loosest of plot reasons, and makes Frey only capable of a brisk jog while in town. Characters that do not play vital roles in the plot are either boring or annoying, and this may be another reason why Frey's rudeness simply didn't bother me that much, as I typically wanted to get the fuck away from them as fast as possible too. And then the biggest problem of this game is the open world itself. With Athea being a dying world, there are definitely plot reasons with this expanse being empty and dull. But it does come across as an excuse to develop limited resources. In a lot of ways, this justification for an empty world reminded me of Arkham Origins, where unlike Asylum that took place in, well, an asylum, so in that game it made sense why you only encountered criminals, and Arkham City took that approach to a citywide takeover by largely the same rogues gallery. Origins was a lifeless version of Gotham that only featured enemies because, well, it was Christmas time and it was snowing, so yeah, all the law-abiding citizens were just home. And yet, while there are no towns to discover in Forspoken or any other world building in this game to really speak of outside of cutscenes and journal entries, this game is littered with collectibles, side objectives, incremental upgrades, and enemy encounters with a fairly limited stock of enemy types. This is map pollution to its most extreme degree. And while it's Ubisoft that usually gets made fun of for this sort of thing, placing this many dots on the map in an otherwise dead world betrays the fact that all of this is just padding. And man, this game really just does pad out everything. Finding equipment is almost always locked behind copy-pasted dungeons or fighting identical mobs in small little hamlets, as every little collectible in this game serves some type of purpose. And so even something as simple as going from point A to point B in this game always becomes an exercise in managing ADHD. The loop in this game can be explained pretty simply. Look at your map and find the general location that the main quest or side mission is pointing you in. Stumble upon one of this game's literal hundreds of diversions on your way, take one on and complete it. Continue on your path, get pulled away from it by a fight or a chest, or whatever, and then rinse and repeat. And real quick, while on the subject of chests, some of these are locked behind rudimentary slide puzzles. Just as a quick aside, I always was terrible at these type of things as a kid, never being able to really figure them out. So in no small way, I have to thank Forspoken, as I now consider myself pretty good at these kind of things. So I guess that's a win. Continue on your way, make some incremental progress, stop by a rest house, or go activate a tower that serves as this game's equivalent to an Ubisoft tower. Report back to town to trade in some found collectibles for incremental upgrades through this game's really efficient network of fast travel points, and then head back into the wild before you are distracted with something shiny on your way to the next waypoint again. But getting to your next waypoint usually requires for you to figure out ways of navigating this game's terrain. And there's really just no way I can accurately count how many times I would be heading towards a highlighted objective only to find that it was blocked off by some palisades. And then I had to try and find a side path to take the long way around. And every step that you take in a new direction is an opportunity for this loop to dig its hooks in all over again. And then, sometimes, the game pushes back with nightmare encounters. Strong enemies that constantly spawn into the environment. Some of these are tied to map objectives, but some of these encounters just seem to be random events in the open world, where the only way to escape from the endless encounter is to get Frey to a safe house. And at its absolute worst, I found myself trying to platform to a remote area when one of these nightmare battles started, and I was unsure as to whether or not this one was random. So what followed was one of the most hostile bits of game design I've ever seen, as I was trying to do some difficult platforming with limited visibility, all while enemies infinitely spawned. Multiple times I thought about turning back, unsure if this was a random event or not. And after I finally died and returned to the area to try this all over again, it turned out, no, this was scripted. And this section, geez, I had a headache. This section left such a bad taste in my mouth, but even after finishing it, the same loop started all over again. But it's not just moving through this world that can feel padded at times, as it plays into the upgrading system as well. Upgrading spells in this game takes place through completing arbitrary challenges, of which there are only 3 at a time that can be activated, and that's just not enough considering how many abilities there are in this game. And while most of them are interesting, there are a couple that really serve the same purposes, but just with different spell effects. And upgrading your gear is tied directly into stuff that you collect in the field, so not only are you going out into the field to try new challenges on your way to a waypoint, but you're also collecting every little stick and stone that you find on your way there. And, you're constantly teleporting between the field and the safe houses to incrementally upgrade your stuff, or maybe you're just going back there to visit whatever new cat that you found in the overworld. And let's just say this, by the time that you found more than a couple of these, it's clear that Frey must be suffering from toxoplasmosis, as there is no way that any human can enjoy sharing such close quarters with this many cats. I like cats. I have one of these little monsters running around my place, and while I do love him, keeping the place clean with just one of them is certainly more challenging than it should be. So this many cats, it's not happening. And even these cats are padded out because a lot of them are sharing a lot of the same assets, but it's just a new color change this time. All this is made worse because more than anything, this world is just bigger than it needs to be. I platinumed this game, I beat all of the super bosses, I upgraded all of the spells, I maxed out my favorite equipment, and even still, the map looked just as overloaded as it was by the end with all these diversions. And this bloat, it kills the pace of what could have otherwise been a solid experience. And this is made especially apparent when you consider the fact that the map is littered with experience points in the form of mana dotting around the landscape. These are nice to collect while you're leveling up and while you're unlocking abilities, but after you've unlocked everything, there are still way too many left on the map at any given time. And so by the time I completed this game, I had a surplus of over 1,000 experience points with nothing to spend them on other than unlocking chests that had become easy to unlock at this point. And even certain consumables that are used to upgrade only like 1 or 2 things, they are still populating the map. So there is no finite amount of these things. This is not the kind of game where you have to explore every nook and cranny to have just enough resources to get by. They are plentiful, and in a lot of cases, they are overabundant, and they betray the size of this world. It is clear that the developers wanted you to find these things, but in a world so big, they just kind of copied-pasted resources all around to make sure that you didn't miss out on anything integral. And doing so, being thorough in this game, really actually puts you into a bit of a bind. As when I was trying to max out all of my spells, I kept finding myself in situations where I was far too powerful for the fodder enemies dotting the landscape. And so in more than a few cases, I actually had to ratchet the game's difficulty up to hard mode just so that they would survive long enough for me to proc off some new condition. Really, it is this where the game holds a lot in common with Final Fantasy 15. as that world was far too big for its own good as well. But while trekking or driving around Eos offered opportunities for its cast to riff with one another, find one of the game's awesome side dungeons, or simply go buy some cup noodles, Forspoken has none of these side diversions. Everything is copy and pasted in this game. And even though both of these games take place in largely dead worlds, Forspoken is just a little less interesting. And really, the pacing works the same in both games too. When Final Fantasy 15 came out, a lot of people complained that the game was a largely open world experience, and then suddenly, once you passed the point of no return in that game, it became a linear hallway to the end out of nowhere. And Forspoken has these same issues as well. But where Final Fantasy 15 built bonds between its characters and really dug into some spectacle before tying the very soul of this game to this simple yet effective campfire ending.
You guys are the best.
Forspoken fails in comparison by really just having the relationship between Frey and Cup to focus on.
Hello, and welcome to the Athea. I'm afraid the coffee here is not authentic and full of artificial sweeteners.
Wow. It's almost like you don't want us to drink here.
Yes, the owner is very duplicitous. Get out while you can.
Before info dumping at the very end. And I loved Cuff. He was a well-acted, snarky son of a bitch, but between heavily reused quips and failing to be as well-rounded as Nier's similar character of Grimoire Vice, Forspoken really stumbled in the race towards this game's end, even though I did find myself invested in the rest of this game's ending. And sadly, this seems to be what Luminous's legacy will ultimately be, I'm afraid. Two overly bloated open world games that struggled to make it across the finish line, even though they were both filled with great little moments along the way that made it clear that there were more than a handful of amazingly talented individuals at the team who clearly cared about what they were making. There were moments that I found myself loving Forspoken. Some of the combat encounters had me invested thoroughly. The scenes with the Tantas were amazing not only from a technical standpoint, but the performances and art direction were top tier here as well. There were some specific locations on the map that were really amazing to behold, with some of them being some of my favorite locations I've ever seen in a game. And this traversal of the world, especially with some of the late game upgrades, made it even better to explore. In a lot of ways, I think it's difficult to accurately describe how good this game can feel at the times where you are blasting your way through the environment and just taking it all in. And then while the narrative was spotty at points, it managed to always punch above its weight in some really surprising and impactful ways. And specifically through the characters, including Robian and Frey, they really won me over. But somewhere along this game's development, this world that had been so painstakingly made, and this narrative that had clearly mattered to some of the team, was clearly not enough content to justify this game's development time. And someone decided that in order to utilize all of the assets, traversal, and combat system, this game needed to be bogged down with endless amounts of filler, and content that only served to distract from what was otherwise pretty solid, and in some ways, special. There is another version of Forspoken that exists somewhere out there, I'm sure, that is fuller, more content rich, and then tells its story at a better pace. But considering what we have here, I can honestly say that this game could have just been cut down. I played about 60 hours total, and while I didn't gather every collectible on the map, I found the ones that mattered to the progression of its systems. I saw all of the content this game had to offer in a lot of ways. I even went as far as to platinum the game. And I can honestly say that had the map been shrunk down in size, had a lot of these points of interest been removed from the map and just made it smaller in scope, this game could have already been much better than what we have. I loved parts of Forspoken. I think that it has the soul of a much better game in there somewhere, but I don't know if I could recommend it to anyone other than the most hardcore of Square Enix fans, especially for $70. But hopefully, with Luminous Productions being seemingly absorbed into the larger Square Enix ecosystem, hopefully this talented group of people will find themselves in roles where they can work on projects that make better use of their skills. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching as always. It is always greatly appreciated. You may have noticed that over the course of this review, I kind of went back and forth with my feelings of Forspoken. There are parts that I love and there are parts that are not great. But I covered this game in the first place because I was interested in it from the beginning. And I am not an all or nothing kind of person. If there is something in an experience that really stands out, that will come to define my enjoyment of it far more than something that just kind of fails. So with that said, I found plenty to love about this experience. If you've been watching my channel for a little while now, you know that I cover games. Sometimes I cover them in review form. Sometimes I use the game as a jumping off point to discuss other topics. And then also I have one other video where I've started ranking every game ever made. And I'll be continuing those rankings in the next video. Forspoken will definitely be included in that list, and we will see how it's stacked up to the rest of the games that I've played on this channel. But until then, please go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, you know how it goes, all the standard YouTube stuff. And hopefully I will see you in the next video. Till then, you're all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.